All right, so you sent me this fascinating podcast episode, and it's called Unlocking Emotional Wellness, 5 Affordable Strategies for Healing. And I have to say, the blend of ancient teachings with modern science really caught my eye.
Yeah.
It's hosted by an Israelite theologian.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking at how a text like the Bible
Right.
speaks to like our very modern struggles,
Yeah.
with things like doom scrolling
Mm-hmm.
and existential dread.
It is really interesting to see how a lot of these ancient principles are often rooted in a deep understanding of human nature
Right.
and also our relationship with Yahweh, and are now being validated by scientific research. It's like we're coming full circle, rediscovering these timeless truths, but through this modern lens.
Yeah. And the podcast host, he jumps right in with this statistic from the American Psychological Association that I thought was really interesting.
Mm.
He said that chronic stress is a major contributor to mental health issues.
Sure.
No surprise there.
Yeah.
Right.
We're all feeling it.
We're all feeling it.
It's the constant pressure
Yeah.
of modern life, wouldn't you say? But what I think is interesting is that the podcast host, he frames this within the context of Exodus 20.810, the commandment about keeping the Sabbath.
Right.
He argues that Yahweh designed us to rest, and when we neglect that, we suffer consequences,
Right.
both physically and emotionally.
So it's not just about getting enough sleep.
Right.
It's about intentional rest.
Right.
Right. Like actually disconnecting from the hustle and bustle and everything.
Absolutely.
But hold on. Does science back this up too?
Absolutely. There have been studies that have shown that regular rest, especially when it involves disconnecting from work and technology, can improve our mood significantly and even our cognitive function. It's like hitting the reset button for our minds and our bodies.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this ties together. Ancient wisdom, modern science. Let's get real for a second. In today's world, it's hard to escape the comparison trap.
Oh, yeah.
Especially with social media. You log on and everyone seems to be living their best life while you're just trying to survive.
It's a constant bombardment of curated perfection.
Right.
And it can be incredibly disheartening. But the podcast host offers an antidote, one that's rooted in both scripture and science: gratitude.
Gratitude, like just being thankful. I mean, it's a nice sentiment, but can it really move the needle when it comes to emotional well-being?
The podcast host argues that it's not just a feeling, it's like a way of life. He cites 1 Thessalonians 5.18, where Paul encourages us to give thanks in all circumstances.
Right.
This isn't about ignoring the challenges, it's about choosing to focus on Yahweh's blessings,
Okay.
even amidst the difficulties.
That's powerful. Does science actually back up this idea that simply being grateful can actually improve our mental health?
There's actually quite a bit of research on this. Studies published in Psychological Science show that focusing on what we're thankful for can reduce anxiety.
Okay.
And it can even improve our physical health.
Wow, that's incredible. So practicing gratitude, it's not just a feel-good activity. It's actually rewiring our brains for positivity.
Yeah.
I'm starting to understand why the podcast host calls this an affordable strategy. It doesn't require money, just a shift in perspective.
Exactly. It's about aligning our hearts and minds with the truth of Yahweh's goodness, even when things are tough.
So we've covered rest and gratitude. What's the next strategy that this theologian dives into?
He talks about the power of community, emphasizing that we are not meant to walk through this life alone. He cites Ecclesiastes 4.9:10, which talks about the strength that we find in supporting one another, sharing burdens, and celebrating joys together.
And that really resonates with me. You think about how often we hear about the loneliness epidemic,
Right.
especially after the pandemic. We're more connected than ever through technology.
Mm-hmm.
But genuine human connection seems to be dwindling.
And the consequences are very real. Harvard Health has published research showing that strong social ties protect us from stress and contribute to longevity.
So it's not just about having a fun group to hang out with.
Right.
It's about having people you can rely on.
Right.
People who understand you and can offer support when you need it.
That's right. And the podcast host reminds us that this is also deeply rooted in our relationship with Yahweh. We are a part of his body, the community of believers, called to support and encourage one another.
I love how he weaves those two perspectives together, the practical benefits of social connection and the spiritual dimension of being part of Yahweh's family.
It's a holistic approach to well-being, recognizing that we're complex beings with physical, emotional, and spiritual needs.
Okay, I'm hooked. What's next on this journey toward emotional wellness?
The podcast host then delves into something that's becoming more and more popular even outside of religious circles: mindfulness, and meditation. But he approaches it from a distinctly biblical perspective.
Oh, this should be interesting. We hear a lot about mindfulness these days. But how does this Israelite theologian tie it back to ancient scripture?
He starts by acknowledging the struggle.
Yeah.
Our minds are constantly bombarded with information.
Yeah, distraction.
Distractions, anxieties. He then points to Philippians 4.67 as a solution, encouraging us to bring our anxieties to Yahweh in prayer
Right.
and to experience the peace that comes from surrendering our worries to him.
So instead of just trying to empty our minds, which, let's be honest, is pretty impossible in today's world,
Right.
it's about focusing our minds on Yahweh, on his promises, and on his presence.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Psychology Today, hardly a religious publication, has published tons of articles on the scientifically proven benefits of mindfulness practices for reducing stress and improving mental clarity.
Wow, so even secular research is catching up to what the Bible's been saying for centuries.
Uh-huh.
It's like we're rediscovering the power of prayer and meditation as tools for emotional well-being.
It is. It's about reclaiming these ancient practices and integrating them into our modern lives, recognizing that true peace and well-being is found in our connection with Yahweh.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to ask, how does someone actually incorporate mindfulness into their daily life? It seems like such an abstract concept.
The podcast host offers some really practical advice. He suggests starting small, maybe just 5 minutes a day, to quiet your mind, focus on your breath, and reflect on Yahweh's promises. He even suggests using guided meditation apps, which are readily available these days.
That's a great starting point. It doesn't have to be this grand, overwhelming practice. Just a few moments of intentional stillness and connection can make a world of difference. All right, we've covered rest, gratitude, community, and mindfulness. What's the final strategy for emotional healing that the podcast host presents?
He ends with a topic that is both incredibly challenging and incredibly liberating: forgiveness. And as with the other strategies, he approaches it from both a spiritual and a scientific perspective.
That's a heavy one. We all know how hard it can be to truly forgive, especially when we've been deeply hurt. I'm really curious to hear how he tackles this topic within the framework of his theological perspective.
He begins by citing Matthew 6.14-15, where Yahshua emphasizes that forgiving others is essential for receiving Yahweh's forgiveness.
Right.
The act of forgiveness, he argues, is not about condoning the actions of others, but about releasing ourselves from the bitterness and resentment that can poison our hearts.
It's about breaking free from that emotional prison, right? It's about choosing to move forward with grace and compassion, even when it's incredibly difficult. But is there actual scientific evidence to support the idea that forgiving others can be beneficial for our own well-being?
The podcast host cites research from the Journal of Behavioral Medicine that shows a strong correlation between forgiveness and reduced anger, stress, and even improved cardiovascular health.
Wow, so forgiveness isn't just a noble ideal. It's literally good for our physical and emotional health. It's like choosing to heal ourselves by releasing the grip of anger and resentment.
Exactly. And while it's important to acknowledge that forgiveness is a process, often a very difficult one, the potential benefits for both our spiritual and physical well-being are undeniable.
You know, one thing that struck me about the podcast host's discussion of forgiveness is that he framed it as an act of empowerment. He said, when we choose to forgive, we reclaim our power from the person or situation that hurt us. We break free from the chains of bitterness and step into the freedom of Yahweh's love and grace. That's such a powerful way to look at it. It's not about weakness or letting someone off the hook. It's about taking back control of our own emotional well-being.
That's a really insightful observation. It highlights the transformative potential of forgiveness, both for the individual and for our relationships with others.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about rest, gratitude, community, mindfulness, and forgiveness. 5 powerful strategies for emotional healing rooted in both ancient wisdom and modern science. And I have to say, I'm already feeling inspired to make some changes in my own life.
It's amazing how these seemingly simple practices can have such a profound impact on our overall well-being.
It's like we've been given a roadmap to a more peaceful, joyful, and fulfilling life.
Exactly. And it's a journey we don't have to take alone. We have the guidance of Scripture, the support of community, and the ever-present grace of Yahweh to sustain us along the way.
So we've explored these 5 incredibly powerful strategies for emotional healing, and I'm already feeling a bit lighter just thinking about them. But let's get practical for a moment. How can we actually incorporate these ancient yet timeless principles into our modern, often chaotic lives?
Well, it's about taking those small, consistent steps that over time can lead to, significant transformation. Let's start with rest on the Sabbath. The podcast host emphasizes that it's not just about getting enough sleep, which, let's be honest, many of us struggle with, but about intentionally creating space for rejuvenation and connection with Yahweh.
It's funny because in our productivity-obsessed culture, rest is often seen as a sign of weakness or laziness. But the podcast host argues that it's actually an act of obedience to Yahweh's design for us and essential for our well-being.
Yeah, he even suggests incorporating some of the ancient Sabbath rituals into our modern lives. Things like disconnecting from technology, spending time in nature, enjoying a special meal with loved ones, and engaging in activities that bring us joy and connect us with Yahweh's presence.
I love that. It's about reclaiming the Sabbath as a time of spiritual and emotional renewal, not just a day off from work. And, even if we can't dedicate a full 24 hours to Sabbath rest, we can still carve out pockets of time throughout the week to unplug, recharge, and reconnect with Yahweh.
Absolutely. Even just a few minutes of intentional quiet time spent in prayer or meditation can make a world of difference. And what about gratitude? We talked about its transformative power, but how do we actually cultivate a grateful heart in the midst of the daily grind?
It's so easy to get caught up in complaining about traffic or work deadlines or that never-ending to-do list. How do we shift our focus from what's wrong to what's right, especially when life throws us those curveballs?
The podcast host suggests starting a gratitude journal. Just take a few minutes each day to write down 3 things that you're grateful for. Could be something as simple as a sunny day or a delicious cup of coffee or a kind word from a friend.
I've tried gratitude journaling before, and I have to admit, it felt a bit forced at first. But after a while, I started to notice a shift in my perspective. I became more aware of the blessings in my life, even the small ones.
That's the beauty of it. It's about retraining our brains to focus on the good instead of dwelling on, the negative. And, the podcast host, he even challenges us to find things to be grateful for in difficult situations.
That sounds incredibly tough.
Yeah.
How can we possibly be thankful when we're going through hardship or loss?
Well, he argues that it's not about denying the pain or pretending that everything is okay. It's about recognizing that even in the midst of suffering, Yahweh is still present, still working, and still offering his comfort and grace.
That's a powerful perspective. It's about trusting that even in the darkest of times, there's still something to be grateful for, even if it's just the strength to keep going. Okay, let's move on to community. We talked about its importance for our well-being, but in today's world, it can be hard to find genuine connection.
The podcast host acknowledges this challenge and offers some really practical suggestions. He encourages us to be intentional about reaching out to others, to join community groups or volunteer organizations, and to prioritize face-to-face interactions over virtual ones whenever possible.
I think that last point is so important. We can easily get caught in the trap of thinking we're connecting with people through social media, but it's often a very superficial connection. There's something really powerful about being physically present with others, sharing meals, laughter, and stories.
He even suggests something kind of radical, inviting our neighbors over for dinner, offering to help someone in need. It's about stepping outside of our comfort zones and extending hospitality and kindness to those around us.
I love that. It's about reclaiming the ancient practice of hospitality, not just as a social nicety, but as a way to build bridges and strengthen our communities. Okay, now let's talk about mindfulness. We explored how the podcast host connects this practice to prayer and surrendering our anxieties to Yahweh, but how do we actually incorporate mindfulness into our busy lives?
Well, he suggests starting small, even just 5 minutes a day, to practice being fully present in the moment. He encourages us to focus on our breath, to notice the sensations in our bodies, and to pay attention to our thoughts without judgment.
That sounds really challenging, especially for someone like me whose mind is constantly racing. Do you have any tips for actually quieting the mental chatter?
Well, he suggests finding a quiet space where you won't be interrupted. Close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and simply observe your thoughts and feelings as they arise. Don't try to fight them or push them away. Just let them come and go like clouds passing in the sky.
That's a great analogy. It's about becoming an observer of our own minds rather than getting swept away by every thought and emotion.
Exactly. And, the podcast host, he also suggests incorporating mindfulness into everyday activities. Pay attention to the taste of your food when you eat, the warmth of the water when you shower, the feeling of the sun on your skin.
It's about bringing that same sense of presence and awareness to even the most mundane tasks. I'm starting to see how mindfulness can become a way of life, not just something we do for 5 minutes a day.
Precisely. It's about cultivating a sense of peace and stillness that can permeate every aspect of our lives. Okay, let's delve into the final strategy, forgiveness. We talked about its transformative power, but how do we actually move towards forgiving those who have hurt us, especially when the wounds are really deep?
I think that's the million-dollar question. Forgiveness can feel like an impossible feat, especially when we've been betrayed or deeply wounded.
The podcast host acknowledges the difficulty of forgiveness, but he also emphasizes its necessity for our own emotional and spiritual well-being. He reminds us that holding on to anger and resentment only harms us in the end.
It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die right. But how do we actually let go of those painful emotions and choose to forgive? Where do we even begin?
He suggests starting with prayer. Ask Yahweh to help you soften your heart towards the person who hurt you. He also encourages us to remember that we are all imperfect, all capable of hurting others, and all in need of Yahweh's forgiveness.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to judge others harshly, but when we recognize our own shortcomings, it becomes easier to extend grace and compassion. But what about those situations where the offense is so severe that it feels impossible to forgive?
The podcast host acknowledges that there are times when forgiveness may feel, out of reach. He encourages us to seek professional counseling if needed, and to remember that forgiveness is often a process, not a one-time event. He also emphasizes that forgiveness doesn't mean condoning the hurtful actions, but rather releasing the emotional hold that they have over us.
That's a really important distinction. It's about choosing to let go of the bitterness and resentment that can poison our hearts and hinder our ability to experience true peace and joy.
He even suggests writing a letter to the person who hurt you, expressing your pain and choosing to forgive them, even if you never actually send the letter.
That's a powerful exercise. It allows us to process our emotions and make a conscious choice to forgive, even if the other person never acknowledges the harm that they've caused. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the practical application of these 5 incredible strategies for emotional healing. What are your final thoughts on this?
I think the most important takeaway is that these strategies aren't quick fixes or like magic formulas. They require effort, intentionality, and a willingness to surrender to Yahweh's guidance. But the rewards are immeasurable. When we choose to prioritize rest, cultivate gratitude, engage in community, embrace mindfulness, and practice forgiveness, we open ourselves to a life of greater peace, joy, and emotional well-being.
It's about aligning our lives with Yahweh's design for us, recognizing that true healing and wholeness are found in our relationship with Him and the way that we choose to live our lives.
It's a lifelong journey, and there will be bumps along the way, but with Yahweh's help, we can experience the transformative power of these ancient yet timeless strategies.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into emotional wellness,
Yeah.
I'm curious what resonated most with you from this podcast episode. Was there a particular strategy that kind of stood out or a piece of wisdom that like really struck a chord?
What really impressed me was how the podcast host emphasized that these strategies aren't just for like the spiritually elite, or those with tons of free time.
Right.
He really stressed that these are affordable strategies,
Yeah.
accessible to everyone regardless of background or circumstance.
That's such an important point because sometimes self-improvement advice can feel really exclusive, like it's only for people with certain resources or lifestyles. But these strategies are rooted in simple everyday practices that anyone can incorporate into their lives.
He even pointed out that some of these practices, like Sabbath rest and community engagement, were cornerstones of ancient Israelite life.
Right.
They weren't seen as luxuries, but as necessities for a healthy and balanced existence.
And it's fascinating how these ancient practices are now being validated by modern science. We're rediscovering the wisdom of our ancestors through the lens of research and data.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. It's not just about ancient teachings or modern science, it's about the beautiful intersection of the two. It's about recognizing that true well-being encompasses our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves.
So as we conclude this exploration, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've unpacked these 5 powerful strategies, prioritizing rest and Sabbath, practicing gratitude, engaging in community, cultivating mindfulness, and embracing forgiveness. But the journey toward emotional wellness is ultimately a personal one.
It is. It's about discovering what works best for you, what resonates with your heart and helps you feel more connected to Yahweh and aligned with His purpose for your life.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. You have the support of community, the guidance of Scripture, and the ever-present love and grace of Yahweh to sustain you along the way.
So take what you've learned from this deep dive and start incorporating these practices into your own life. one step at a time. Be patient with yourself, celebrate the small victories, and trust that true healing and lasting joy are always within reach.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. We hope this deep dive has empowered you to prioritize your emotional well-being and embrace the transformative power of these ancient yet timeless strategies for living a more joyful and fulfilling life. Until next time, may you find peace, healing, and abundant blessings in your pursuit of emotional wholeness.